asking for each person that comes up is just deliver a message that's from the heart of God, what your heart is burning for. Not necessarily that we got to follow some program or that we're in a series or anything like that, but I want you to hear his heart today. So we welcome Preston.
All right. Is this microphone on? You guys hear me okay? Hey, so listen, I'm just going to be straight up. I do not like dressing up. So I was like, how can I get away with wearing a hoodie today? So we had this custom like fusion hoodie made for our youth group just so I could get away with wearing a hoodie today. Because the only time you can get away with speaking in like casual clothes is if it's church affiliated. So I'm just coming clean. This was all intentional just so I could be comfy this morning. Real quick, has any of you guys gone on a road trip recently? Like anyone kind of road trip lately? Like you're going out of town. Who uses? Let's take a quick poll. Do you guys use Google Maps or Apple Maps? All right, raise your hand if you say Google. Google Maps. Oh, you guys are my people. Raise your hand if you say Apple. Raise your hand if you're still in the generation with the road map and you're like, what's? Okay, that's cool. I love you too. You guys are my people. One thing I've learned very quickly is if you're an Apple Map person, I'm really going to offend you, but Apple stinks. Like, I end up on all the weird detours when I use Apple Maps, and I'm driving and I'm navigating, and I always hit a detour. Have any of you guys ever used Apple Maps and ended up on a road that is no longer a road? And you're like, what is going on? I'm driving, I'm hitting puddles. I used it one time, and I was driving down this like hill, and I'm like, this is getting pretty rough. And boom, there was a stream flowing over the road Apple was trying to take me on, like a whole river. And I'm like, okay, this is kind of weird. I don't think this is the way it's supposed to go. So I switched to Google Maps very quickly. But I say all that to say that how many times does it take for Apple to just mess me up to where I'm like, I'm done, I don't trust you anymore? And what we're going to talk about this morning is what, I'm going to move this because I move a lot when I speak. What we're going to talk about this morning is the doubt that surrounds you and I in our relationship with God. The trust issues that you and I may have in this relationship with God. And maybe you're here this morning, you just hit this mad detour where you're like, this makes zero sense as to why I'm here. And you're here this morning, great, we're going to talk about it. Maybe you're just killing it with Google Maps and like Jesus is just navigating you and everything's going smooth and you have no issues. Man, I'm glad you're here. But we're going to dive into all these things. I was going to give another illustration about trust, and I was going to have a couple kids come up, and I was going to do a trust fall, and then I'm like, I have trust issues, so I'm not going to trust them guys to catch me. So I was like, I'm going to bring them up, and I'm like, yeah, but if they miss, I guess I could like bounce back and teach from that. About this is why we have trust issues. But if you guys are taking notes, man, I love it. I'm a big note guy. Like, let's take notes. Let's dive in this together. I will tell you this morning, I'm not going to necessarily throw a bunch of like single verses at you. I'm going to summarize a bunch of things in the Bible within a couple chapters to kind of lay a foundation as we go. So we're going to be talking about Moses and the Israelites and kind of some of their journey on their faith and their relationship with God. But real quick, I want to challenge you guys because what we're so guilty of as a church, at capital C church, isn't any shot at Res Life. What we're so guilty as all believers, capital C church, is we like to cast ourselves in the hero's role. So when we read Moses and we read all about him, we're like, I'm Moses. And can I just tell you, there's a lot of things in the Old Testament where it was foreshadowing the gospel of what Jesus was going to do. So this morning, as we dive into this, don't fall trapped to be like, I can really relate to Moses. Because in all reality, you're just the Israelites in this story. And Jesus is the Moses that is delivering us. So I just want to lay that foundation before we get into it. We're going to kind of dive through Exodus chapter 7 through chapter 11, and we're going to kind of move quickly. So let's lay this foundation. The Israelites are now slaves to Egypt right now, and they're going through this whole phase where Pharaoh and the Egyptians are using them, and yet God is madly in love with these people and desires for them to be set free. So what he does is he uses Moses. He sends Moses to use him to bring deliverance. And keep in mind here, this is Jesus. He sends Moses to the Israelites then, but he sends Jesus to the people today. And what we do is we go through this and we see, if you guys don't know the story, if you're not familiar, I don't want to assume things, but he sends Moses and Pharaoh says, no, I won't let the people go. And he keeps holding on to the Israelites. And then God's like, I'm going to do these 10 plagues. And check these out. If you don't know these 10 plagues, I got a list for you. First thing, water becomes blood, which is kind of freaky. Frogs start going everywhere. If you don't like frogs, you wouldn't like this. Then there's lice, which we all... Then there's flies, the livestock get disease, there's boils, there's hail, there's locusts, there's darkness. And to wrap it all up, God flexing is he takes the firstborn of the people. And he puts this rule, you've heard this before, where he tells the Israelites, paint the blood of the lamb over the door and your children will be safe. And he goes through this and he takes Pharaoh's son, his firstborn, which if you don't know was like Pharaoh's boy. Like he was so excited, he was madly in love. And this finally broke Pharaoh to the point where he allows the Israelites to leave. And what's interesting about this is not only did Israelites gain freedom from this, but he also sent them with all the animals. He says, take all your livestock, just get out of Dodge, like just leave. And I think this is really cool. This is, I think, the first part to where God is ultimately showing his power to bring freedom to the Israelites. And we're going to move on very quickly. Like I said, I'm going to kind of lay a foundation here before we get into the message. We're going to get back to this story here. God provides, we see multiple things. God provided animals and food for the Israelites. Then he gave them a promise for their future. And then he gives a cloud by day and a pillar of light by night to guide them. All right? I'm just laying this. All these things God's doing for them. And God does these three things for us today. And number one is he provides our needs. Number two, he promises a future. And number three, he promises our guidance along the way. Now, I don't know about you guys, but if I was an Israelite, there would be zero part of me that would doubt that God's good. That God's got power because he's delivered me. He's done these 10 miraculous plagues and it's been amazing. And he gives me a cloud to guide me. And then he gives me a pillar of light at night. And like God is just showing off in the power, right? So everyone's like, man, Israelites are good. God's people are good. We see God's power and God's goodness and we're good. And then this little situation pops up called the Red Sea. I guarantee they were using Apple Maps when they hit the Red Sea. It was just like, boom, oh man. So they hit the Red Sea, and I don't know if you guys remember what happens to the Israelites the minute they hit the Red Sea. Man, they start yelling at Moses. They start yelling at God. And they're like, why would you do all these things to bring me to the point where I'm going to die? I would rather be a slave to Egypt than to suffer out here in the wilderness. And how many of us are so guilty of that as believers? Man, sin was so much more comfortable. I would rather be living in sin than struggling in my faith. And we're doing the same thing today that the Israelites were doing. See, we see that God's power is on display in each and every one of our lives, but the minute life gets hard, we're like, God, this stinks. I would rather go back to living in sin, because if you know anything about anything, that when you're living in sin, the devil's your best friend and he never attacks you and your life is great. Right? We're sinful by nature, man's depravity. We're all born into sin, all of us, by flesh or under the curse of sin. So sin feels good. Sometimes when you're going against the grain and resistance, it can hurt. So we see this Red Sea situation. We'd rather die. And there is a moment where God speaks to Moses as to what he's meant to do next. And there is a very, very awesome, I think it's Exodus 14:14, he's speaking. And it says, do not be afraid, stand still, see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. For the Egyptians, whom you see today, shall never see again, no more forever. The Lord shall fight for you if you would just hold on to your peace. Now, can I just give you teenagers, because you're my group, I'm going to give you a Gen Z translation. So for you adults, stand by. Gen Z says, shut up and let me work for you. Like, that's pretty much what God and Moses is saying here. Like, if you would just chill out, God's got this. And I think so many times, something you need to hear today, whether you're here on your faith journey and you're established in the church or you're established in your home church, wherever it is, would you just be still and let God work for you? We're too busy focused on the doubt and we lose sight of who God is. So we see these things. There's 4 things that I think that Moses said to the Israelites, that Jesus is saying to the people today. And number 1 is don't fear. First thing Moses said was, do not be afraid. Don't fear. If you're here today, don't fear your future. Don't fear what's coming tomorrow. Stand in God's promises today. Number 2, what Moses says is he says, stand still. And what Jesus is saying today is don't run. Don't run from this. You may get scared. Things may get a little rocky right now in your faith. You may not understand what's going on, but don't run away. Stand firm. Keep going. Next, he says this, see the salvation of the Lord, which he will accomplish for you today. Number 3 is focus on God's ability to deliver you. Focus on this ability. Moses said, stand still. Like, focus that God is going to save you. Salvation is coming. And Jesus saying the same thing to you. Would you just focus not on what you're facing, but that God is God and God's going to save you and deliver you? He says this, he'll do this. And next he says, for the Egyptians whom you see today, you'll never see again anymore. I love this. I love when Moses is like, hey, you see, like, you got to understand, they're at the Red Sea looking at this huge body of water. Behind them's this massive army. And Moses is like, hey, let's chill out because those guys over there, you're never going to see them again after what's about to happen. Like, I don't know about you guys, but when Jesus tells me, hey, I know things are looking hectic right now, but if just take one more look and everyone you see there, you're just not going to see it again. Like, I don't know about you guys, but I have major doubt in this. Like, are you sure? Like, are you sure I'm never going to deal with this again? And number 4, what Jesus is saying to us today is we need to allow God to fight for us, but also believe that God promises victory. Because so many times we can find ourselves in this weird position where, like, I really believe God can fight for me, but I really don't have this belief that I could ever get victory. And some of us will go our whole lives in this whole relationship with God saying, I understand the concept that God can fight, but I really just don't believe victory could ever be mine. And there's some of us in this room that needs to focus on maybe all 4 of these things. Or maybe you just need to focus on one of the 4, maybe a couple of the 4. But what we need to do is we have to shift our perspective, because the one thing I've noticed is doubt is the devil's favorite tool to use against believers. It really is. I can tell you it's easier to exercise my doubt than it is my faith some days. And I'm not too proud to say that. I'm not going to sit here as one of the youth student pastor, whatever you want to call me. I'm not too proud to tell you that I don't have it all together some days. And there are days where I struggle. We're going to look at this new section of scripture as well. We're going to shift over to Numbers 13 to save you and I the headache. I'm not going to read this. If you want to go back and read and try to announce all the names, good luck. I knew I was going to botcher one of them up, so I'm like, I'm not even going to read that. So let me give you, there's a bunch of people, a bunch of names. Moses is spoken to by the Lord, and he tells him to pick spies to go into the promised land. After they've been delivered from the Red Sea, he says there's a promised land waiting for you. And he says, get some spies and send them. So Moses very quickly grabs up some spies and he sends them to check out this promised land. Now, what's interesting about this is, do we really think that God had to allow them to see what the promise was? Like, if you think about this, why in the world would God say, go ahead and check this out for yourself, rather than just letting them walk right into it? See, it's just speculation. I can't help but wonder if God was like, you need to see what I'm about to do for you in order for you to appreciate the promise you're about to live in. Because what happens is they go there and they check it out and they find out there is a bunch of residents in this promised land, and they're all bigger and they're all meaner and they're all badder than the Israelites. And they come back and Moses is like, what'd you see? And they're like, there's no way. We can't do this. Like, we're going to get crumbled. We're not going to be able to live in this. So what they do is, rather than trusting the promise of the promised land, they look at everything around them and they start to be doubtful. And can I tell you that sometimes the doubt you're facing is God literally wanting you to recognize that his power is about to be on display. He wants you to see everything around you that you're like, there's no way this is going to happen. And God's like, watch me. And what we do is we start treating doubt and we start wondering, God, why would you show this to me? God, why would you allow me to live in fear for a moment? Because Have no mistake, Israelites were terrified of what was in the promise. They were scared of what was waiting for them. And I think sometimes we are so quick to jump to conclusions rather than look at the bigger picture. So I want to give you two options, or rather, not only two options, but two things we see happen in our faith. Letter A is we look through our point of view when we try to analyze the situation. Right? We look through our point of view. We look at church, we look at Christians, we look at lost, and we look through our eyes, and yet we miss so much because we try to logically analyze this. Or you do letter B, and you look through the lens of God's promise. I remember as a kid, there were drunk goggles that would come to school when they talked to us about not drinking and driving, and they'd put drunk goggles on us, and man, you were so disoriented, and they'd make you try to shoot a basket, and everyone laughed because you could never do it. And what I found out is what you look through in your lens is very important to how you perceive God's promise. Because God's promise isn't always a smooth paved road. Sometimes there's hardships, and there's pain, and there's dysfunction that happens. But yet God says, if you just trust this, I can bring it to promise. So what are you looking through today? What lens are you looking through? Are you just looking at the promise of your future through your analytical mind? I'm the first guy to talk about logic with you. First guy to tell you, cut out emotions, let's be logic on this, right? But how many times does that rob us of our ability to step into this? See, what we see is God's intention was never to scare the Israelites. He didn't desire for them to be discouraged. And can I tell you, God's desire was never for them to wander the wilderness for 40 years either. And how many times do we do things in our life that were never part of God's plan, but yet he says, you won't step into it, that's on you. The promise has been given, and I'm here to tell you, church, there has been a promise made to the body of believers, and yet we're too busy wandering the wilderness because we hit one single snag, and we're like, I can't do this anymore. This hurts, I can't do this. It was easier for me to live in sin than it is to be what God called me to do. I can't do this. And I can tell you very confidently that God was looking for the Israelites not to wander on, but to stop and just say, I trust you and I believe you got this. He was looking for them. See, here's what I know is God gives you an opportunity every day to exercise your faith. And can I tell you, faith is the believing of the things unseen. So I'm not telling you, when I say faith is not just saying I believe in God because I can't see him, but faith is your ability to believe in the circumstance that isn't here right now, to believe in the promise that isn't here right now. And so many times we look at faith and we're like, I believe in Jesus because I don't see him, but I believe. And it's like, bro, faith is so much more than just believing in God. It's believing that he's got this. And I realize today that I don't want us to ever place our doubt or our fear or our trust issues above God's promises. And I got a dry mouth up here, jeez. But what I find out so many times, especially in young believers, is we can logically know the promise, but in practicality, we'll never step into it because there's too many roadblocks. And if we don't allow God to have control over our lives, if we don't freely give. See, what I also wonder is, was there a total submission in the Israelites' lives? Was there 100% submission where they said, God, it's yours? Listen, here's what I know is our lives are meant for God. We were created for God. You weren't created for yourself. And if the Israelites would have known, if I live or die tomorrow, it's irrelevant because my life is God's. And what's interesting enough is they were in a place where they said, you know what, even if I die on the hill of God's promise, I still died for him. And what we need to do is we need to get to this place of complete and total submission that says, you know what, I don't know what the promise may look like, but I know God's in control. And I will give every part of me to this. And it was interesting enough, as we're going to shift gears for a little bit. One, I will take the name of Faster Pastor today. It's on the checklist, get Faster Pastor title. I'm a very competitive person. So what I want to shift over to in this conversation is there has been a promise over each and every one of our lives to walk in relationship with God. There's been a promise of restoration. There's been a promise of healing. There's been a promise of strength to keep on fighting when healing doesn't come. And can I tell you that the church, as the bride of the Christ, we have just been stuck in this engagement phase for far too long. Me and God's been dating a little bit. He proposes, we get engaged. And I'm like, you know what? I'm not sure I'm ready for that kind of commitment. And how many times is the church filled with a bunch of believers? You can have the biggest church, and yet you're filled with a bunch of people who aren't ready to step into the next season of relationship with God. You have churches who've been 50, 60, 100 years in this engagement phase that have never stepped into the next season of relationship. And I got to thinking when Rusty was like, man, we just, speak what's on your heart. I really want the congregation to get a feel for what your heart is. And can I tell you what my heart is for the church to be what the church is meant to be. For the church to be healthy. For the gospel to be elevated above everything else. For you and I to have a heart to leave the building and win souls. But also for us to live in a healthy relationship, a healthy marriage with the unity of the Lamb of God. And I'm telling you, there's a season at hand, and I made a video one time for Rusty. There's a season at hand where I said, the harvest has been promised. There's a season of promises that's been given over us as a body. And I love it. But the question is, will we allow doubt and trust issues and a lack of faith to rob us from going into a marriage and trusting the promise of the next season? There's no doubt it's a little funky, I'm here. It was a God thing, hands down, that we transitioned here. And can I tell you, there was a promise I felt in my heart for the next season that was to come at Res Life. And marriage is meant to happen here. And can I tell you, if you think the perfect marriage is existent, then you're obviously not married. And if you think in dating you're going to find the perfect spouse, you're madly mistaken. We're all flawed. But can I tell you that there is zero flaws in the character of God, and yet why are we not stepping into marriage? We want perfect relationship. Well, it's there. It's accessible. Marriage is possible with the kingdom of God, but what is stopping us? So I pose this question to you. What is stopping you? What is stopping you from going from here to the next step in your relationship, the next step in your commitment to God? Can I tell you, don't get mad. Please don't shoot. Can I tell you, if you think you are called into a relationship to come to church at Res Life on Sunday mornings, you're sadly mistaken. You aren't called just to come to church. No marriage is called just to hang out on the good times. My wife and I love my wife. Shout out to my wife. She's a babe. Can I tell you that no marriage that is healthy only goes out to dinner and laughs and has a good time? There's a lot of roadblocks on the way. And your marriage with God is going to have a lot of roadblocks, but are you committed enough to stand firm when you're struggling? Are you committed enough because you have a love for God? Can I ask you, are you coming to church? Are you following God out of obedience to God and adoration of God? Or are you just following it out of obligation to someone else? Right. Some of us spend our whole lives going to church because we feel obligated because someone else wants us to go. Yeah. And yet you're never living a life that says, I'm just madly in love with God. I'm just madly in love with the bride. I'm madly in love with the groom. Like, I can't stop falling in love with you. I want to know, how are we doing with this as a church? Because the promise is given, and yet you and I, we need to step into this relationship. We need to step into it. Could you imagine, I think in like images, could you imagine, the way I see this is God standing, waiting for you to walk down the aisle so he could receive you. And it's awkward because the music keeps looping. And everyone's like, where's the bride at? Where's the bride at? Music's just looping. It's just looping. He's like, all of a sudden Jesus is on the right-hand side of God. Just like, hey, where are they at? Are they coming? Someone go check on the bride. Like, where are they at? We've been waiting forever for them. Meanwhile, we finally show up. Boom! We're walking down, our hair's a mess, we have no makeup, we have no pretty dress. We're like, hey, what's up, baby? And what happens is I feel like the church is in this phase where even if we are the bride, there's no part of us that says, I want to present myself holy and honorable and pure to you. God, you can accept me with my messy bun and my sweatpants. You can accept the mess, but I'll never change to make myself presentable for you. What kind of love is it if a bride would walk down the aisle and say, I don't care what I look like, you see what you get, and I'm never changing? The marriage day is going to be totally tainted, and I'm asking, maybe the stepping into the marriage has never happened because you and I aren't even willing to clean ourselves up for the union of us and God. This is a call to repentance as a church. I want to stand in front of God where he's like, wow, that's mine. I get to take that. That's mine. Honorable and pure and beautiful and holy. The marriage is meant to happen, but where are we at with this? I'm going to leave you with that question. Chelsea, if you could cue up a song. I'm going to do something. One thing I always do. Man, we are the faster pastor today. Listen, I'm the kind of guy, I'm going to come out with a steak. I'm going to grill that steak. I'm going to smack you in the face and say, go eat. So what we're going to do, we're going to close on this song. This is like an 18-minute song. If y'all know Maverick City, that's about average. This song it was beautiful because I was praying, God, where do I navigate? Is this really what you want me to speak? And I came in here Friday morning, and I was just praying over the sanctuary for this morning. I was worshiping. I'm like, God, what do you want to speak? Is this right? Is this wrong? And this song came on called Getting Ready by Maverick City. I don't know if you guys have ever heard it. But the way we're going to close this morning, we're going to do it a little different. I want to close on this song, and can I tell you, if you're in this phase where you don't know God, and can I tell you God's on one knee just proposing, saying, here's the gospel, will you be in relationship with me? Can I tell you God's sending flowers your direction 24/7, saying, hey, you ready to get married yet? You ready? Our big day's coming. Are you ready? Are you going to come? Are you going to be part of this? I just want to encourage you as this song comes out, let's have a time of reflection. It says, guys, are we ready for marriage? Are we filled with doubt, doubting the promise that God's already given? And if you are, can I tell you, what better place to be than at church? If you need prayer, what better place to be than right here and to get prayer with your siblings, the family of God, the kingdom of heaven. And I'll tell you what, if you need prayer, I know we have a prayer team. If you need prayer, man, y'all are welcome to pray during the song. If you're at the point where you're like, I think I'm good, like, great, fantastic, we're going to play the lyrics and we're just going to worship. What better way than sing the praise of our groom? Better way to usher in a relationship than praise him. You know, but can I tell you, don't just find yourself sitting in a lackadaisical position where you're just being lazy because you don't want to press in or you don't want to commit. All right, Chelsea, we got that song ready? All right, sweet. I'm going to get off here. I'm going to get out of the way. Let's just worship. You guys need prayer.